Elena's hands trembled as she held the faded photograph, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. The woman staring back at her from the yellowed paper looked exactly like her. Same dark eyes, same stubborn jawline, but standing in front of a mansion that could have been from another world entirely. "Vivian Calder," she whispered, reading the barely legible name scribbled on the back. The name that would shatter everything she thought she knew about herself. "Thanks so much for being here, my amazing story family. If you're excited for today's adventure and ready to dive in, make sure to hit subscribe and share in the comments where you're tuning in from. And don't forget, another captivating story awaits you tomorrow. You definitely won't want to miss it." 10 years earlier, the winter night had been brutal when she first found him. A small boy crouched beneath the library steps, shivering in a coat far too thin for the biting cold. Elena was exhausted from her double shift cleaning hospital floors, her hands raw and aching, but something about that haunted little face stopped her dead. "Do you want some soup?" she had asked quietly, pulling out the thermos she'd been saving for herself. Julian's wide, frightened eyes flickered up to meet hers, and slowly he nodded. That single moment of trust would bind them together for the next decade. Through empty cupboards and broken heaters, through nights when neither could sleep because the street noise never stopped, Elena had given him everything. Her food when she had barely enough for one. Her bed when the apartment grew too cold. Her love when the world had none to offer a homeless child. But what Elena discovered in that dusty shoebox would change everything she thought she knew about her life. The photograph in her shaking hands wasn't just any random picture. It was proof that she wasn't who she believed herself to be. While she had spent 10 years scraping by, feeding a hungry child with whatever scraps she could find, sacrificing her own meals and warmth to keep Julian alive, the truth was waiting in the shadows. The truth about a family fortune worth billions. About a grandmother who had been searching for her for decades. About enemies so dangerous that hiding her identity had been the only way to keep her safe. Elena wasn't just a struggling woman who cleaned hospital floors and fed homeless children out of the kindness of her heart. She was the missing heiress to one of the most powerful fortunes in the country. But the truth about who she really was would shake her to her core. Have you ever wondered if your whole life might be built on a lie? Drop a comment and let me know. That night 10 years ago, Elena had been walking home from her second job, her feet aching in worn-out shoes that had seen too many miles. The hospital cleaning shifts paid just enough to cover her tiny apartment, but barely left anything for food. She clutched the thermos of soup, her only real meal of the day, close to her chest as the wind cut through her thin jacket. When she spotted the small figure huddled under the library steps, every instinct told her to keep walking. She had her own problems, her own hunger to worry about. But Julian looked so small, so completely alone, that something deep inside her refused to move past him. "Hey there," she said softly, crouching down to his level. "Are you okay?" The boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, looked up with eyes that held far too much knowledge for someone so young. His clothes were dirty, torn in places, and his shoes were held together with duct tape. He didn't answer, just stared at her with a mixture of hope and terror. Elena knew that look. She'd worn it herself, bouncing from one foster home to another, never quite belonging anywhere. "I have soup," she offered, unscrewing the thermos cap. The warm steam rose between them like a bridge. "It's chicken noodle. Not fancy, but it's hot." Julian's stomach growled audibly, and his cheeks flushed with embarrassment. Still, he hesitated. "My name's Elena," she said, pouring the soup into the thermos cap. "What's yours?" "Julian," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind. She handed him the makeshift cup, watching as he wrapped his small fingers around it like it was the most precious thing in the world. When he took that first sip, his eyes closed in relief, and Elena felt something shift inside her chest. This wasn't just soup anymore. This was the beginning of everything. What started as one bowl of soup became a daily ritual. Elena would find Julian in different spots around the neighborhood. Behind the grocery store, in the park, sometimes back under those library steps, and she would share whatever she had. A sandwich from her lunch break. An apple she'd saved from the hospital cafeteria. On really tough days, just a candy bar from the vending machine. Her coworkers thought she was crazy. "Elena, you can barely feed yourself," her friend Maria would say, watching her divide her already meager lunch in half. "That kid isn't your responsibility." But responsibility felt like the wrong word. Julian had become something more essential than that. He was her purpose. The first winter was the hardest. Elena's apartment was barely big enough for one person, and the heat worked sporadically at best. But when she found Julian sleeping in a cardboard box behind the dumpster during a particularly brutal cold snap, she didn't hesitate. She brought him home. Just for tonight, she told herself, laying out blankets on her cramped couch. Just until the weather gets better. One night became two. Two became a week. The weeks stretched into months, and suddenly Julian wasn't just a child she fed. He was the child who lived with her, who depended on her, who had become the most important person in her world. The sacrifices started small but grew larger with each passing year. Elena took on a third part-time job, cleaning offices after midnight, so she could afford enough food for both of them. She wore the same 3 outfits for 2 years straight, mending holes and worn spots until the fabric barely held together. Her own meals became smaller, simpler, often consisting of whatever Julian couldn't finish. When Julian got sick with pneumonia at age 10, Elena spent 3 sleepless nights by his bedside, missing work shifts she couldn't afford to miss. She used her entire savings, all $87, to pay for antibiotics the free clinic couldn't provide. "Why do you do this?" Julian asked her one night when he was 12, his voice thick with the guilt that had been building inside him for years. "You could have a better life without me." Elena was darning socks by lamplight. Their electricity had been turned off that week, and she looked up at this boy who had grown tall and lean despite their circumstances, whose eyes still held that deep well of hurt but now also held love. Her love. "Julian," she said, setting down her needle, "before I found you, I was just surviving, going through the motions. You gave me a reason to live, not just exist." School was a constant struggle. Julian was bright. Elena could see it in the way he devoured every book from the library, in the questions he asked about everything from science to history. But keeping up with classwork was nearly impossible when you were always tired, always hungry, always worried about where your next meal would come from. Elena did what she could. She helped with homework by candlelight when the power was shut off. She walked him to school on days when the bus fare was needed for food instead. She attended every parent-teacher conference, even when it meant losing wages from missed work hours. By the time Julian was 14, he had grown quiet in a way that worried Elena. Not sullen or angry, but carrying a weight that no teenager should bear. She caught him looking at job postings sometimes, clearly planning to drop out of school to help support them. "You're going to finish high school," she told him firmly during one of their heart-to-heart talks over a dinner of rice and beans, again. "And you're going to college if that's what you want. I don't care what I have to do to make it happen." "How?" Julian asked, his voice cracking with frustration. "We can barely afford food. College costs thousands and thousands of dollars." Elena reached across their tiny kitchen table and took his hands in hers. "I don't know how yet. But I know we'll find a way. We always do." Those were the moments that defined their relationship. Not just Elena caring for Julian, but both of them caring for each other in the only way they knew how. He started working small jobs when he turned 15. Contributing what he could while still managing to keep his grades up. Elena took on weekend catering gigs, serving at weddings and parties for people who lived in a world so different from theirs it might as well have been another planet. Through it all, they had each other. They had their small apartment with its leaky faucet and temperamental heater. They had their tradition of splitting a candy bar every Friday night as their dessert. They had their shared dream that someday, somehow, things would get easier. Elena never imagined that the answer to their struggles was hidden in a shoebox in her closet, waiting to be discovered in a photograph that would change their entire world. Elena gave up everything for this boy. Her comfort, her future, her own dreams. What's the most selfless thing someone has done for you? Share your story below and let's celebrate those everyday heroes who change lives through love. It was a Saturday afternoon in late spring when Elena decided to tackle the closet. Julian was at his part-time job at the corner market, and she had a rare few hours to herself. The apartment felt almost spacious without both of them trying to navigate around each other in the cramped space. She'd been putting off this cleaning project for months, maybe years. The closet was stuffed with boxes she hadn't opened since moving in, old clothes that no longer fit, and random items she'd accumulated over their decade together. Most of it would probably end up donated to the shelter downtown. The shoebox was wedged in the back corner, underneath a pile of Julian's outgrown winter coats that she couldn't bring herself to get rid of. It was plain cardboard, unmarked, the kind that might have once held a pair of cheap shoes. Elena almost tossed it into the donation pile without opening it. Something made her pause. The box felt heavier than it should have, and when she shook it gently, she heard the soft shuffle of papers inside. She sat cross-legged on the bedroom floor and lifted the lid. Inside were documents she barely remembered saving. Her birth certificate, social security card, a few report cards from her earliest foster placements. But underneath those official papers, wrapped in a piece of faded tissue paper, was something she had never seen before. A photograph. Elena's hands began to shake as she unwrapped it carefully. The photo was old, the colors slightly faded, but clear enough to stop her heart. A beautiful woman with dark hair and familiar eyes stood in front of an enormous mansion, holding a baby wrapped in what looked like expensive lace. The woman was smiling, but there was something sad about her expression, something that spoke of love mixed with loss. The baby's face was partially visible, and Elena felt a strange recognition looking at those tiny features. The same dark eyes, the same small nose, the same stubborn chin that Julian always teased her about. With trembling fingers, she turned the photograph over. In faded ink, someone had written, "Vivian Calder, 1983. The year Elena was born. She stared at the photo for a long time, her mind racing. The woman looked like her, not just similar but like they could be related. And that baby. Elena brought the photo closer to her face, studying every detail. The mansion in the background was unlike anything in Elena's world. Massive stone columns, perfectly manicured gardens, windows that sparkled like diamonds. It was the kind of place she'd only seen in movies or magazines, the kind of home that belonged to people with more money than she could comprehend. But who was Vivian Calder? And why did Elena have this photograph? She searched through the rest of the box more frantically now, looking for any other clues. There were no other photos, no letters, no explanations. Just that single image that seemed to hold secrets Elena had never known existed. Her heart was pounding as she sat there on the floor, surrounded by the debris of their simple life, holding what might be the key to a completely different existence. The woman in the photo, Vivian Calder, had been holding that baby with such tenderness, such obvious love. But if that baby was Elena, what had happened? How had she ended up in foster care, believing her parents had died in a car accident? The questions multiplied in her mind until she felt dizzy with them. She looked around their tiny apartment, at the couch where Julian slept, at the kitchen table that wobbled because one leg was shorter than the others, at the window that didn't quite close properly and let in drafts all winter long. This had been her entire world for so long that she'd stopped imagining anything different. But this photograph suggested a world she'd never known existed. A world where she might have belonged to someone who loved her, someone who had resources and power and the kind of life Elena had only dreamed about in her most secret moments. When Julian's key turned in the lock an hour later, Elena was still sitting on the floor, still staring at the photograph, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Elena, what's wrong?" Julian dropped his backpack and rushed to her side. His face immediately filled with the kind of concern that came from years of watching out for each other. She held up the photograph with shaking hands. "I found this. In the closet. I've never seen it before, but—" Julian took the photo carefully, studying it with the same intensity Elena had. His eyes moved from the woman to the baby to the mansion, and she watched understanding dawn on his face. "That looks like you," he said quietly. "Both the woman and the baby. The name on the back is Vivian Calder. 1983. The year I was born." Julian was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. "Do you think... could she be your mother?" "I don't know. Maybe my grandmother. I was told my parents died when I was a baby. But what if that was a lie? What if there's family out there who—" Elena's voice trailed off, unable to finish the thought. That night, after they'd shared a quiet dinner of pasta and canned sauce, Elena borrowed an old laptop from Mrs. Rodriguez downstairs. Julian sat beside her on the couch as she typed Vivian Calder into the search engine, both of them holding their breath as the results loaded. What appeared on the screen was beyond anything Elena could have expected. Vivian Calder wasn't just wealthy. She was legendary. Article after article described her as the widow of industrial magnate Robert Calder, a man who had built an empire from steel and shipping that was worth billions of dollars. The Calder name appeared on hospitals, libraries, university buildings across the country. "Look at this," Julian whispered, pointing to a news article from 5 years earlier. "She's worth over $3 billion. Elena scrolled through photo after photo of charity galas and society events. Vivian Calder, now in her 70s, appeared in formal gowns at museum openings, cutting ribbons at hospital dedications, shaking hands with politicians and celebrities. But in every photo she looked reserved, distant, as if she was going through the motions of a life that didn't quite fit. "Here," Elena said, clicking on a longer article about the Calder family history. This mentions children. The article was from a business magazine, detailing the Calder industrial empire and its future. Buried in the middle was a paragraph that made Elena's heart stop. Robert Calder died in 1995, leaving his vast fortune to his widow Vivian and their only child, daughter Margaret Calder. However, Margaret disappeared shortly after giving birth in 1983 and was declared legally dead 7 years later. The fate of Margaret's infant daughter remains unknown, leaving questions about the Calder inheritance that have never been resolved. Elena read the paragraph 3 times before the words fully sank in. Margaret Calder. Could that have been her mother? And if so, what had happened to her? Why had Elena ended up in foster care while a fortune sat waiting? Elena, Julian said softly, if this is true, if you're really part of this family. I know. She closed the laptop, suddenly overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they'd discovered. But why was I given away? Why didn't they find me? And why do I have this photograph if I was supposed to be lost? They stayed up until 3 in the morning, researching everything they could find about the Calder family. The more they learned, the more questions arose. There were hints of family drama, mentions of legal battles, whispers of scandal that had been carefully buried by expensive lawyers and public relations firms. By the time they finally went to bed, Elena's head was spinning with possibilities and fears. She was potentially the missing heiress to one of the largest fortunes in the country. But she was also a woman who had spent her entire life believing she was completely alone in the world. Elena barely slept that night. She kept thinking about the photograph, about Vivian Calder's sad smile, about the baby who might have been her. When morning came, she was already sitting at their small kitchen table, the photo in front of her, Julian's coffee growing cold beside her. We have to find out for sure, she said when Julian emerged from the bathroom, rubbing sleep from his eyes. How? He asked, settling into the chair across from her. It's not like we can just call up a billionaire and ask if she's looking for a long-lost granddaughter. But as the day wore on, Elena became more convinced that's exactly what they needed to do. The photograph hadn't appeared in that shoebox by accident. Someone had put it there, had wanted her to find it eventually. The question was who and why now? She spent the afternoon at the library, using their computers to dig deeper into the Calder family history. What she found painted a picture of wealth and privilege, but also of loss and mystery. Robert Calder had been a self-made man, building his fortune from nothing. He and Vivian had married young and seemed devoted to each other, but they'd only had one child, Margaret. The articles about Margaret were sparse and carefully worded, but Elena could read between the lines. There had been some kind of scandal, some reason why a young mother from one of the wealthiest families in the country would disappear without a trace. And that baby, Elena herself, had somehow ended up in the foster system with no one knowing her true identity. That evening, Elena made a decision that would change everything. I'm going to call, she announced to Julian as they sat down for dinner. Call who? The Calder estate. There has to be someone there who knew Margaret, who might remember what happened. Julian set down his fork and looked at her seriously. Elena, what if they don't want to be found? What if there was a good reason you were hidden away? The thought had occurred to her, but the photograph suggested otherwise. The love in Vivian Calder's eyes as she held that baby. It didn't look like the expression of someone who wanted to give a child away. What if they've been looking for me all these years? Elena countered. What if they think I'm dead like my mother? They found the number for the Calder estate online. Elena stared at her phone for 20 minutes before finally dialing, her heart pounding so hard she was sure Julian could hear it across the room. The phone rang 3 times before a woman answered. Calder residence. Elena's voice came out as barely a whisper. Hello. My name is Elena Martinez. I'm calling because I think I might be related to the Calder family. There was a long pause on the other end. Then, could you hold, please? Elena waited, gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles went white. Julian moved closer, trying to hear the conversation. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the woman came back on the line. Her voice was different now, warmer but also carefully controlled. Miss Martinez, my name is Marlene Patterson. I'm Mrs. Calder's personal assistant. Could you tell me what makes you think you might be related to the family? Elena took a deep breath. I have a photograph. It's from 1983, and it shows a woman named Vivian Calder holding a baby. I think that baby might be me. The silence on the other end was so complete that Elena thought the call had been disconnected. Then she heard something that made her heart stop, the sound of someone crying softly. Miss Martinez, Marlene said, her voice thick with emotion. We've been waiting for this call for over 30 years. Discovering you're secretly an heiress? Would you claim your inheritance, or would you be afraid of what you might find? Tell me what you'd do in the comments. Elena's legs nearly gave out beneath her. She sank into the kitchen chair, Julian's steadying hand on her shoulder the only thing keeping her grounded. Waiting for this call? Elena managed to whisper, I don't understand. Miss Martinez, Marlene's voice was gentle but urgent. Where are you calling from? Are you safe? Are you alone? The questions came so quickly that Elena felt overwhelmed. I'm in my apartment. With Julian. He's like family to me. Good. That's good. Miss Martinez, I need to ask you some questions, and I need you to answer them as honestly as you can. Can you describe the photograph? Elena looked down at the faded image still clutched in her free hand. It shows a woman with dark hair standing in front of a large house. A mansion. She's holding a baby wrapped in white lace. The woman is smiling, but she looks sad. On the back it says, Vivian Calder, 1983. She heard Marlene take a shaky breath. The lace was from Mrs. Calder's wedding dress. She had it specially made into a christening gown for her first grandchild. There was a pause. Miss Martinez, what do you remember about your childhood? Nothing before age 5, Elena said, the words coming automatically after years of giving the same answer to social workers and therapists. I was told my parents died in a car accident when I was a baby. I grew up in foster care. No car accident, Marlene said firmly. Miss Martinez, Elena, your mother was Margaret Calder. She was Mrs. Calder's only child, and you are her only granddaughter. The room seemed to tilt around Elena. Julian moved his chair closer, wrapping his arm around her shoulders as she struggled to process this information. What happened to her? My mother. Marlene was quiet for a long moment. It's complicated, Elena. And dangerous. More dangerous than you can possibly know. Mrs. Calder will want to meet you, to explain everything herself. But we need to be careful about how we do this. Dangerous. Julian leaned closer to the phone. What kind of dangerous? Who is this? Marlene asked, her voice becoming guarded again. Julian, Elena said quickly. He's my family. Whatever you tell me, you can say in front of him. Another pause. Then, Elena, there are people who have spent the last 30 years believing you were dead. People who benefited from your absence. If they discover you're alive. Elena's hand tightened on the phone. Are you saying someone wanted me gone? I'm saying your mother disappeared for a reason. She was trying to protect you from something or someone within the family itself. Mrs. Calder made the impossible decision to let you stay hidden rather than risk your safety. The kitchen felt too small suddenly, the walls pressing in around them. Elena had spent her entire life believing she was alone, that no one had wanted her. But what if the truth was the opposite? What if someone had loved her enough to give her up? Mrs. Calder never stopped looking for you, Marlene continued. She hired private investigators, searched through adoption records, even had people monitoring foster care systems across the country. But whoever hid you did it well. Too well. Then how do you know it's really me? Elena asked. The photograph you described, only 3 copies were ever made. Mrs. Calder has one. Margaret had one. And the third was given to the people who promised to keep you safe until it was time for you to come home. Elena felt tears streaming down her face. Time to come home? Elena, you need to understand something. Mrs. Calder is 78 years old. She's been fighting cancer for the past 2 years. The doctors, they don't think she has much time left. She's been waiting her entire life to see you again, to explain what happened, to make sure you know how much you've always been loved. The weight of 30 years of separation, of missed birthdays and holidays, of a grandmother who had been grieving a granddaughter she thought was lost forever, settled over Elena like a heavy blanket. I want to meet her, Elena said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice. But Julian comes with me. Of course, Marlene said immediately. Mrs. Calder will want to meet the young man who's been part of your life. She'll want to thank him. Thank him. Elena, Mrs. Calder may be wealthy, but she's also been utterly alone since Margaret disappeared. Knowing that you've had someone who cared for you, who protected you the way Julian has, it will mean everything to her. Elena looked at Julian, this boy who had started as a stranger under library steps and become the most important person in her world. He squeezed her hand, his eyes bright with unshed tears. When? Elena asked. Tomorrow, if you're ready. I'll send a car. A car? Elena, Marlene said gently, you're going to need time to adjust to a lot of changes. The Calder estate is, well, it's not like anywhere you've ever been. And there are security concerns we need to address. After they hung up, Elena and Julian sat in silence for a long time, both trying to absorb what had just happened. Elena wasn't just a cleaning woman who had spent 10 years feeding a homeless child. She was the missing heiress to a multi-billion-dollar fortune, a granddaughter who had been mourned and searched for and loved from a distance for 3 decades. The car that arrived the next morning was unlike anything Elena had ever seen. A sleek black sedan with tinted windows, driven by a man in a suit who introduced himself simply as Thomas. Julian whistled low under his breath as they settled into leather seats that probably cost more than their monthly rent. The drive took 45 minutes, winding through parts of the city Elena had never seen before, past gates and walls that grew progressively higher and more elaborate. When they finally turned onto a private road lined with ancient oak trees, Elena felt her breath catch. The Calder estate wasn't just a mansion, it was a world unto itself. The main house rose from perfectly manicured grounds like something from a fairy tale, all stone and glass and soaring towers. Gardens stretched as far as the eye could see, with fountains and walking paths and what looked like a small lake in the distance. "Jesus," Julian murmured beside her. "You could fit our entire neighborhood in there." Marlene Patterson was waiting for them on the front steps, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and an expression that spoke of barely controlled emotion. She embraced Elena immediately, holding her for a long moment before stepping back to look at her face. "You look exactly like Margaret at your age," she said, tears streaming down her cheeks. Exactly like her. She led them through halls lined with portraits and art that Elena was sure belonged in museums. The house was beautiful but felt more like a monument than a home. Cold marble floors, soaring ceilings, furniture that looked too expensive to actually sit on. "Mrs. Calder is in the garden room," Marlene explained as they walked. "She wanted to meet you somewhere that felt less formal. She's been so nervous, Elena. She's barely slept since we spoke yesterday." They found Vivian Calder sitting in a sun-drenched room filled with plants and windows that looked out over the gardens. She was smaller than Elena had expected, almost fragile, but her eyes, the same dark eyes Elena saw in the mirror every morning, were sharp and bright with intelligence. When Vivian saw Elena, she gasped and rose from her chair with shaking hands. "My dear girl," she whispered, reaching out tentatively as if Elena might disappear if she moved too quickly. "My beautiful girl. You're home." Elena found herself moving forward, and suddenly she was in her grandmother's arms, breathing in the scent of expensive perfume and feeling the frail strength of arms that had been waiting 30 years to hold her. They sat together on a cushioned bench, Vivian holding Elena's hands as if she was afraid to let go, while Marlene served tea from china so delicate it looked like it might shatter at a touch. Julian sat quietly nearby, clearly overwhelmed but trying to stay alert and protective. "I need to tell you about your mother," Vivian began, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "Margaret was the light of our lives. Robert and I tried for years to have children, and when she finally came, she was everything we dreamed of. Beautiful, intelligent, kind-hearted. She could have had anything, done anything. What happened to her?" Elena asked softly. Vivian's expression darkened. "She fell in love. Not with someone we would have chosen, a young man from a middle-class family, someone without connections or wealth. But she loved him completely, and when she became pregnant with you, she was happier than I'd ever seen her." Elena felt Julian shift beside her, recognizing the familiar story of love transcending class boundaries. Robert's brother Charles had always expected to inherit a portion of the Calder fortune, Vivian continued, her voice growing harder. "When Margaret was born, it complicated things. When you were born, it eliminated his chances entirely. Your uncle wanted you gone," Marlene said bluntly. "The Calder inheritance laws are very specific. Direct descendants inherit everything. As long as you existed, Charles would never see a penny of the fortune he felt entitled to." Elena felt a chill run down her spine. "Are you saying he hurt my mother?" "We don't know exactly what happened," Vivian said, her voice breaking. "Margaret came to us one night, terrified. She said Charles had threatened both of you, that he had connections to people who could make problems disappear permanently. She was convinced that staying would get you both killed. So she ran. She ran. But not before she brought you to us one last time. Vivian reached into her purse and pulled out a photograph identical to the one Elena had found. This was taken that night. She asked me to hold you while she figured out what to do, where to go to keep you safe. Elena stared at the photograph, understanding now why her grandmother looked so sad despite her smile. Margaret had friends from college who worked in social services, Marlene explained. People who understood how to navigate the system, how to place a child where she would be safe but untraceable. They created a new identity for you, a false history about parents who died in an accident. The photograph was meant to be your breadcrumb trail, Vivian said. When you were old enough, when Charles was no longer a threat, someone was supposed to help you find your way back to us. But Margaret disappeared before she could give us the details of the plan. What happened to her? Vivian closed her eyes, and Elena saw decades of pain and guilt written across her face. We found her car 3 days later, crashed into a tree on a mountain road. No body was ever recovered. The police ruled it an accident, but Charles inherited his portion of the fortune 6 months later, Marlene finished grimly. And he spent the last 30 years believing both you and Margaret were dead. Elena felt the world shifting beneath her feet. Her mother hadn't abandoned her. She died trying to protect her. And her grandmother hadn't given her away out of shame or indifference, but out of a desperate love that chose safety over keeping her close. Is Charles still alive? Julian asked, speaking for the first time since they'd arrived. Very much so, Vivian said. He's been managing portions of the Calder business interests for decades. He's powerful, connected, and completely ruthless. If he discovers you're alive, he'll try to finish what he started 30 years ago, Elena said, the words coming out calmly despite the fear racing through her veins. Vivian nodded. Which is why we have to be very careful about how we proceed. Elena, you are the rightful heir to the Calder fortune. Legally, morally, in every way that matters. But claiming your inheritance means putting yourself in danger. Elena looked around the beautiful room, at the gardens beyond the windows, at the grandmother who had spent 3 decades grieving her loss. Then she looked at Julian, this young man who had shared her struggles and her small dreams, who represented everything real and honest in her life. What if I don't want the fortune? She asked quietly. What if I just want my family? Vivian smiled through her tears, and for the first time since Elena had arrived, she looked truly happy. My dear girl, she said, you already understand what took me 78 years to learn. The money doesn't matter. Love is what makes you rich. Elena spent the next 3 days at the Calder estate, and each day brought new revelations that reshaped everything she thought she knew about herself and her family. Vivian showed her through rooms that held decades of history. Margaret's childhood bedroom, preserved exactly as she'd left it, filled with books and photographs and the dreams of a young woman who'd never had the chance to see them fulfilled. There were photo albums documenting birthdays and holidays and family vacations that Elena should have been part of. Gaps in the story where she belonged but had been missing. Your mother kept a journal, Vivian said on the second day, handing Elena a leather-bound book with pages yellowed by time. She wrote about you every day, about her hopes for your future, about how much she loved you. Elena read entry after entry, tears streaming down her face, as her mother's voice came alive on the pages. Margaret had documented Elena's first steps, her first words, every milestone until the night she'd been forced to run. The final entry, dated 3 days before Margaret's death, was heartbreaking in its love and desperation. My beautiful Elena is safe tonight, but I don't know for how much longer. Charles is closing in, and I can feel the walls getting smaller. If something happens to me, I pray that someday she'll understand why I had to let her go. I pray she'll know that every breath I take is for her, that every choice I make is to give her a chance at the life she deserves. She is the best part of me, and she will be loved and cherished even if I can't be there to do it myself. But perhaps most surprising was discovering that Elena wasn't the only one who had been searching for family. During their second evening together, as they sat in the garden watching Julian explore the grounds with the wonder of someone who'd never seen so much open space, Vivian revealed something that changed everything. "I want you to meet someone," she said, pulling out her phone with the careful precision of someone still learning to use modern technology. Within an hour, a car pulled up the circular driveway, and Elena watched a woman in her 50s emerge. She had Margaret's build and Elena's stubborn jawline, and when she saw Elena sitting on the garden bench, she stopped dead in her tracks. "Elizabeth," Vivian called out. "Come meet your niece." Elizabeth Calder Morrison had been Margaret's older sister, a sister Elena never knew existed. She'd been away at medical school when Margaret disappeared, serving with Doctors Without Borders in remote locations where news traveled slowly and family secrets were easier to keep buried. "I've been looking for you for 15 years, Elizabeth said, her voice thick with emotion as she embraced Elena. "Ever since I came home and learned what had really happened. I hired investigators, searched through records, followed every lead that went nowhere." Elena learned she had cousins, Elizabeth's 3 children, now adults themselves, who had grown up hearing stories about their missing cousin and hoping someday she'd come home. She learned about her grandfather Robert, who had died believing he'd failed to protect his granddaughter. She learned about family traditions and inside jokes and the way Margaret used to sneak cookies from the kitchen and leave trails of crumbs that the housekeepers always complained about. She would have loved Julian, Elizabeth said on the 3rd evening as they watched him help the groundskeeper repair a broken fountain. He'd rolled up his sleeves and dove in with the kind of practical knowledge that came from years of making do and fixing things yourself. Margaret always believed that the best people were the ones who knew how to work with their hands and weren't afraid to get dirty. But the most meaningful moment came when Vivian took Elena to a small family cemetery on the estate grounds, where generations of Calders were buried beneath ancient oak trees. Margaret's gravestone was simple but beautiful. Beloved daughter and mother, taken too soon but never forgotten. Elena knelt beside the grave and placed her hand on the cool marble. "I'm okay, Mom," she whispered. "Julian and we're okay. And I understand now why you did what you did." The wind rustled through the trees, and Elena could have sworn she felt her mother's presence, finally at peace knowing her daughter was safe and loved and home. By the 4th day, Elena had made her decision about the inheritance, but not in the way anyone expected. "I want to use the money to help people like Julian and me," she announced at breakfast, looking around the table at Vivian, Elizabeth, and Marlene. "Kids who age out of foster care with nowhere to go. Families who are one paycheck away from homelessness. People who work 3 jobs and still can't afford to feed their children properly." Julian looked up from his plate surprised. They'd talked about this possibility in whispered conversations late at night, but hearing Elena say it aloud made it real. "You want to give away your inheritance?" Vivian asked, but there was no disapproval in her voice, only curiosity. "Not give it away. Use it the way it should be used. Mama Margaret wrote in her journal that she wanted me to have a chance at the life I deserved. Well, every child deserves that chance. Elena's voice grew stronger as she continued. I want to create a foundation that provides housing, education, job training, and support for young people who are struggling the way Julian and I struggled. I want to make sure no child has to choose between eating and paying rent, the way we did for 10 years. Elizabeth smiled. That sounds exactly like something Margaret would have done. And it's exactly what the Calder fortune should be doing, Vivian added. Robert always believed that wealth was a responsibility, not just a privilege. He would be proud of you. Over the following weeks, Elena split her time between the estate and her tiny apartment, slowly bridging the two worlds that had defined her life. She worked with family lawyers to establish the Calder Foundation, with Julian as her co-director and Elizabeth overseeing the medical and psychological support services. But perhaps the most meaningful change was what happened to Julian himself. With access to proper health care for the first time in his life, he was finally able to address the learning disabilities that had made school so difficult. With good nutrition and a stable living situation, his natural intelligence bloomed. Elena watched with pride as he threw himself into foundation planning, his insights about what struggling families really needed proving invaluable. You saved my life, he told Elena one evening as they sat in the estate's library, planning their first shelter facility. But you know what? You saved my life before you ever found out about any of this money. You saved it with soup and kindness and believing I was worth something. Elena looked at this young man who had started as a frightened child under library steps and become her partner in building something meaningful. You saved mine too, Julian. Before I found you, I was just surviving. You gave me a reason to live. The threat of Uncle Charles still loomed. Vivian's lawyers were carefully navigating the legal challenges of Elena's return, and security remained a constant concern. But Elena felt protected not just by bodyguards and legal teams, but by the family she'd never known she had and the family she'd chosen for herself. 6 months after that first phone call, Elena stood in the main hall of the first Calder Foundation transitional housing facility, watching families move into apartments that would give them stability and hope. Julian was across the room, showing a group of teenagers the computer lab where they could work on their GEDs and job training. Vivian, now undergoing treatment that was extending her life beyond what doctors had predicted, squeezed Elena's hand. Your mother would be so proud, she said. You found a way to come home and bring your values with you. Elena smiled, thinking about the long journey from that first bowl of soup to this moment. She was no longer the struggling woman who cleaned hospital floors, but she was still the woman who would share her last meal with a hungry child. The money hadn't changed who she was. It had simply given her the power to become who she was always meant to be. Elena's story shows us that sometimes the family we choose matters more than the one we're born into. Who is your chosen family? Share their story and tag them below. Let's celebrate the people who save us through love.